Hello, everyone. My name is Federico Rodriguez Porcel. I'm a neurologist here at USC, so I have to travel a lot to be here, but it's an honor to be here with you and to introduce Dr. James Galvin, who's the Schroedinger Endowed Chair in Memory Disorders. He was also the founder of the founding director of the Comprehensive Center for Brain Health, and he's also a professor of neurology and professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the University of Miami School of Medicine. He's a director and principal investigator of the Lewy Body Dementia Association Research Center of Excellence. Anyone who has done any research in dementia, my interest in Lewy body, has read his papers. They span from clinical assessments and scales to interventions and non-pharmacological interventions. So he has covered all the bases, everything that's relevant. And I think the most important thing, and the reason why he's here today, is because he has not narrowed it out to the people that can go to the clinic, but he has made an effort to make those outreach to people that may not come to a clinic, that are more difficult, and that's the real challenge. So I'm very honored to present him, and congratulations, Dr. Galvin.
Good afternoon, everybody. I think I stand between you and the end of the conference, right? So I'm very honored to have the opportunity to come and speak with you today. So we're going to talk about how I've approached this concept of brain health and the risk of Alzheimer's and related disorders. I'm just going to use the word Alzheimer's, but I'm going to really covers all the different topics, but instead of saying the long sentence over and over again. Okay. So you've seen this slide before, or variations of it, and we know from the Alzheimer's Association facts and figures and a whole lot of other papers that if you look at different racial ethnic groups, they may have differential risk of disease. So by age, we can see that the United States, African Americans and Hispanics have a higher risk. That's true as early as 65, and it's even more noticeable when we get over age 85. Now, what's interesting, though, is you have to really start to think about what are some of the differences between the different individuals that we talk to. They have very, very different belief systems. And if you don't understand those basic belief systems, it's a little bit hard to figure out how to actually address the problem for those different communities. For example, if you look at some of the studies where they've interviewed Hispanic Americans, and they believe many that this problem with memory is just part of the normal aging process. But the word dementia actually translates into going crazy. So it's a stigma, right? So it's not a disease, it's a stigma. So you don't want to have this concept of a stigma. And there's a whole concept of, my Spanish is really awful, but what this means is this is just the third and final stage of life. This is part of the normal process. You're young and you have a cycle of life. You're in your midlife, you have a cycle of life. As you go into this third stage, it's okay to be forgetful. They also make a lot different use of resources. So it's very unusual for Hispanic families to put their loved ones in a long-term care facility. It's the obligation, particularly in multi-generational homes, that the eldest daughter takes on the role of the caregiver, whether or not there's a spouse present. Now, if you're not aware of that, you can have a very, very different conversation than you really meant to have when you're talking to families. On the other hand, if you look at Black Americans, caregiving is really a shared value, right? So usually there's not one person who steps up and says, I'm the primary caregiver. It's diffused across all the different family members, and they each have jobs. And you have to navigate that. And also, Black Americans, as they get older, tend to report a lot worse in terms of both physical and mental outcomes compared to their counterparts. Similarly, if you talk to Asian Americans or Native Hawaiians or Pacific Islanders or Americanese, you're going to get all these different stories. And if you don't actually take the time to hear those stories, how can we really make a difference, right? So we need to start to think about how these different cultural factors come into play, how these different psychosocial factors come in. What are the gender roles and the expectations about caregiving? What's the role of religion or other traditional beliefs? What are the language barriers? How symptoms may present very differently across different groups. And then what's the sort of the mistrust behind health institutions, because health institutions have done some really terrible things in the past, right? And that's something we kind of have to overcome. So I want to just separate the difference between a health disparity and a health care disparity. So a health disparity is that basically there's a higher burden of illness, disability, or mortality in one group compared to another group. A healthcare disparity has to go to the difference in groups' access and use of care. And so those factors, include a whole bunch of things that may be addressing this. We heard it today about socioeconomic status, geographic location, gender, sexual orientation, but race and ethnicity may also contribute. And so when we think about this, there's lots of reasons why these disparities affect groups. And again, you can't just lump them all together. It's not just all groups, right? These different factors may play a very, very differential role. Again, there's the concept of stigma. What are some cultural differences in health beliefs? What about their disease awareness and understanding? Is this a disease that resonates in that community, right? What's their ability to obtain a diagnosis and to get treated for that diagnosis? And what's their access to care? What's the level of access they have in their community? So I'm going to walk through a whole bunch of studies that I've been doing over the last, as you get older, you tend to say, I just did it a few years ago, but this is 20 years ago now. So I had hair back then. I was heavier back then. And so, but we wanted to sort of address this. One of my really first forays in trying to understand this. So I was at Washington University at the time, and this is a study we did in Missouri. It's a population-based study. It's so old, the way we did the population study, we did random digit dialing, and people answered the phone and talked on the phone for 45 minutes to a surveyor. And so we studied over 1,000 individuals, and we wanted to understand their willingness, their intention to have their memory tested. And we explored a whole bunch of perceptions, and we built this model. Right. And so these are the things that kind of led to the perception or the intention to screen for dementia. So knowledge of the disease and the consequences of the disease, the perceived benefits. Do they have other preventive health behaviors? Do they screen for other diseases? What's their self-efficacy, the confidence to carry out a behavior? And what's their perceived susceptibility? And each of these factors played a really important role. Now, one of the interesting things about Missouri as a state is it largely is white and black. So there are other groups, but the majority of the population is either white or black. And so we're able to study a population-based sample of this. And so we looked at some of the difference. And in fact, there were quite a lot of difference between the groups. And you could see some of those focus around their health beliefs and their knowledge and access to care. These were big things. And so how do you address the problem if the community is not even aware of the problem and can't get to the person who could help them with that problem? So we started thinking about this. And so this was a 20-year journey trying to think about this. And finally, we came down to this concept that we need to improve dementia health literacy, right? And that's the degree to which individuals have the capacity to obtain, process, understand, and use basic health information, right? Now, healthy people 2030. I think we still have a healthy people 2030. I don't know. But the idea is that we want to use all that health information so people can not just make appropriate decisions, but they can make well-informed decisions. And this includes a whole bunch of things. What's our oral literacy, the ability to listen and speak, the print literacy to read and write, and numeracy, the ability to use numerical concepts. But I added something, and that's what about their cultural knowledge? Right? How do they approach this? About 50% of Americans have poor health literacy, and low health literacy has a lot of consequences. They're less likely to use a preventive service. They're less likely to adhere to the medical regimen that you prescribe. They have a higher risk of hospitalization and rehospitalization. And of course, they're not going to participate in research. So we started looking at this. And so how do people actually go about this is they use these literacy tests, health literacy tests. But if you've ever seen some of these health literacy tests, it's a list of words, right? And so if you have a low education, it may be hard to say the word gynecomastia. And even if you could say the word gynecomastia, do you know what it means and how to use it in a sentence? And what does that have to do at all with your ability to process health information? So for dementia, we said, well, what's a way that we can inform people that would go across different cultures. And we took the concept of storytelling, because almost all cultures use storytelling in one way, shape, or form. So we created two stories. The first is Grandma's story, and this is told by a granddaughter describing the changes of Alzheimer's in her grandmother. And the second was Hank's story, and this is told by the widow of someone who died of vascular dementia and how difficult it was for her to learn about vascular dementia and get it diagnosed. And these stories were embedded with factoids, so people, as they're reading the story, could learn. Now, you had to make the story so everybody could read it. So we set it at a 5th grade level, right? So most people would be able to read it. And so I know you can't read all the story, but that's the story. And everywhere that's highlighted is a part of the story that could be culturally adapted. So it didn't matter where you were, where you lived, what kind of activity you did. If grandma didn't make coffee, she could make something else. And so you could replace all of those different terms in the highlighted section and make it now culturally adaptable. That's Hank's story, the same exact idea. And we'd used a pre and post test. And the post test, after they did this, there was a fact sheet. So we could actually educate people about the things they learned and the things that they needed to build their knowledge on. And so we were able to demonstrate that the cohort as a whole were able to gain health literacy. They gained knowledge, and we saw differences in whites and blacks. One of the other things we're really kind of interested in is not just the social determinants, but some of the medical determinants of health. And so this is a study I did when I was at NYU. I'm going to tell a bunch of stories. I've been at a bunch of different places and a bunch of different regions. And so we were able to really study lots of different groups. So we had a community-based study, 374 individuals that lived in Manhattan, Queens, and Brooklyn. Because when I was at NYU, that's the way you could get to with the subways, and that's where NYU bought practices. So we wanted to understand our community, and our community was Lower Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. Okay, didn't go to the Bronx because the Bronx didn't come to NYU. And so it was, a very diverse population, very multinational in its essence. And so we collected a whole bunch of factors and we did a cluster analysis. And again, I'm not going to go through all of these projects in great detail because I want to give you sort of potpourri of how we've addressed the problem. But it was important because we basically found these 3 clusters. So in cluster number 1, white individuals had higher MoCA scores than African Americans and Hispanics. They had higher educational attainment. They had better physical performance. Okay. In cluster number 2, white individuals had better socioeconomic status, higher educational attainment, and lower stroke risk factors. But they actually reported more health problems. In cluster number 3, the white participants had better MoCA, lower self-complaints, and fewer people were diagnosed with diabetes, right? So we had these 3 clusters. The clusters included whites, blacks, and Hispanics. But the whites, you can see, tended to have better health outcomes no matter what cluster they were in, okay? And this was really important because within each cluster, the African-American participants had the worst physical performance and had the slowest motor processing time. And within each cluster, the Hispanics had far more depression than anybody else. So when you're trying to study populations, it's not just looking at one group, it's trying to understand what are the factors that lead to that group and they explain their health outcomes. When I moved down to Florida, what I created was what we call the Healthy Brain Initiative. I realized the CDC has a Healthy Brain Initiative. It's a different thing. This is the name of our longitudinal project. And we wanted to take this concept, this growing concept of precision medicine, right? So how can we understand what normal healthy brain aging is and what puts people at a risk for Alzheimer's and related disorders? But we wanted to do this across representative populations. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how we get everybody to participate in research. And we wanted to ask some really important questions. And the question that I'm most interested in is the same question I asked when I was 6 years old. And that was why, right? If you told me anything, my initial response would be why. So why do some people develop disease and other people don't? Why do some people progress faster than others? Why do some people respond to therapy and others do not? And so we wanted to try to figure this out. So this is our current cohort. We have 479 active individuals, and cohorts are cohorts. Lots of people have cohorts, but I want you to look at this cohort, right? So we wanted to have a representative cohort. So our cohort is 42% not white, right? So we have a cohort that's reflective of our communities. We spend a lot of time nurturing that cohort, right? That allows us to ask a lot of interesting questions. Our area deprivation index, which talks about community resources, spans the entire range from 1 to 10. So we have people from all communities and all walks of life. And we don't recruit people who have dementia because we're trying to study healthy aging and the risk. So we're recruiting people at risk. So it's about a third totally normal people, about a third people who have subjective impairment, and about a third of people who have mild cognitive impairment. And we have a few people now that have converted into dementia. And it's a really deeply phenotyped cohort, right? So they do lots of stuff, right? It's about 10 to 12 hours of stuff we ask them to do. And they're all willing to do that. So we said, well, okay, now I want to study brain health. How do we do that? Well, we don't have any measures. We have to create measures. So we created a resilience index. That is what tells us what puts people the possibility of resisting disease. And we developed subscales. I always often say this is how I spent my pandemic. So we created these scales and we published all these papers in the year 2020, 2021, right? To show you how we developed. We created a measure of cognitive reserve. We created a measure of social engagement, physical activity, cognitive activity, and then we adapted some scales to look at mindfulness and diet. Right. And so controls have more resilience than MCI, and MCI has more resilience than dementia. That's not surprising. But within each group, people who had higher resilience had better cognitive and functional and behavioral outcomes. And that was true across all three diagnostic categories. We also then created a vulnerability index. That is what's put people at a higher risk of developing disease, right? So we created this index. We used machine learning to create a weighted scale. And so there are 12 factors. 4 are not modifiable, but 8 are modifiable. And we wanted to see how that puts people at a higher risk. And so controls have lower vulnerability than MCI. MCI has lower vulnerability to dementia. That makes sense. But within the control group, people with lower vulnerability had better cognitive, functional, and behavioral outcomes. And that was also true at the MCI stage, but was no longer true at the dementia stage. So at a certain threshold, you're no longer any more vulnerable. You've reached the maximal vulnerability. And then we had this big question, well, how do we assess cognitive performance? Cognitive test in community medicine is so biased by education and language abilities that we had to come up with a test that we could remove all of that. And so the test in the lower corner is the number symbol coding test, right? And so the idea was we would take language out of the equation. We would take reading out of the equation. We would give people an answer key at the top of the page. And all they had to do was translate numbers into symbols, then symbols into numbers. And then we would start set switching. So as they went through at the 17th position, they had to go back and forth between the tasks, right? And so that's where people slow down. Even healthy controls slow down, but people who have cognitive impairment really slow down. And it gets to the underlying aspect of all cognition, which is sort of attention and executive function. So we didn't want to create a memory task because then we would only be able to study a memory disorder where we could study stroke, multiple sclerosis, epilepsy. It doesn't matter because it's getting at the basic root of cognition, right? And so now we have a test that tells people who's resilient. We have a test that looks at who's vulnerable, and we can tell how their cognitive performance is at that moment in time. We combine these all and we create a brain health index. So now we have a unitary value of someone's brain health that I could measure in about 12 minutes. Okay. And so we can put these individuals on a scale and look at them, and we created thresholds. People have low brain health, people have high brain health, and people in the middle. There's always people in the middle. In many ways, those are the people that are most interesting because some of them will go on to develop disease and others won't. And so we can start asking questions of why. And we can see that this tracks longitudinally. right? And so people who have high brain health to start with, who stay healthy, their brain health stays pretty stable. People who start out as impaired, they have low brain health, and because they're impaired, their brain health goes down. But really interesting are the people in the middle. So if we have people who start out as cognitively normal and eventually develop a cognitive impairment, you can see that their brain health, that's that sort of greenish line, starts out lower than the people who never develop a disease. And their brain health tracks with their cognitive performance over time. And for people who have potentially reversible causes of impairment, if their memory gets better, their performance gets better, their brain health can actually improve. So we can use this to look and see how they're responding to interventions as well. And what's interesting is we could then look at what puts people at differential risk. So we took that vulnerability index and we looked at our diverse populations. And what we found was that if you look at their vulnerability and you look at their MoCA scores, the people with higher vulnerability, that acted as an accelerant, right, in their cognitive performance, but only in non-white participants, right? So those risk factors had a much greater effect on African American and Hispanic participants than they did on white participants. And the way we solved this, so I was a chemistry major in college. How many chemistry majors out there? Anybody? Yeah. So we used the Hasselbalch-Henderson's equation of enzymatic reactions, and we tested that, and we proved that the vulnerability index acted as an enzymatic reaction to accelerate cognitive decline in people who were not white. And that helps us understand a little bit more about why people are developing disease at different rates. Now, we've been really interested in the social determinants of health, but we're also interested in the structural determinants of health. And so where do people live where they live? They live in their house, but their house is in a neighborhood. Has anybody heard the term redlining before? Right? So redlining was a horrible thing. It's still being done today, but basically it allows you to kind of draw this map and say that this is a bad area. We're not going to make any investments in this area. And so what that does, it further drives down the property rates. And so then investors can buy property at very, very low prices, right? And so this is a map of Miami, and these are all the redlined neighborhoods. And you can see what happens. And so let me show you what happens in an actual neighborhood, right? So this is a hazarded neighborhood in Miami today, and this is a best neighborhood in Miami today. And what's the biggest single difference? Everybody should be able to see the biggest single difference. And what is it? Trees. There are no trees, right? So the top one's an urban heat island, right? It's just concrete, right? It's hotter there than it is where there are trees. And we know that exposure to green space actually improves brain health. So we've done some of this. This is led by Lila Besser in my group, who's an urban planner. And so we've looked at these hazarded neighborhoods. They have less open green space. They have less pedestrian. You can't walk. There's no sidewalks. That was the other thing that you really didn't have in that neighborhood. There are no sidewalks, right? And so how do you walk safely in a neighborhood if there's no place to walk? And if you've ever walked anywhere near a street in Florida, that is taking your life into your own hands, right? And so Black residents with greater neighborhood segregation had much greater declines in their processing speed. I already told you there's some difference in processing speed between the groups from other studies. In this study, we can show that that further enhances the decline in processing speed. If you have more access to green space, you had higher resilience. If you had more discrimination, you had greater vulnerability and more white matter hyperintensities on MRI. And if you had a greater concentration of social destinations and parks in your neighborhood within a 20-minute walk, this concept of the 20-minute neighborhood, you had greater resilience. So your neighborhood drives a lot about your brain health. So how about if we move out of the city, let's move into the rural regions. And so in Florida, you may not think about Florida as having rural regions, but Florida is actually a very rural state, right? So everything along the coast is not rural, but if you go inwards, right, from the beginning of the Everglades, it's very swampy. But as you get a little bit higher, it's mucky. And it's a great place to grow stuff, right? So between the sort of the swamp part of the Everglades and Lake Okeechobee are all the sugarcane farms. From Lake Okeechobee up to the Panhandle are all the citrus farms. And then the Panhandle are all the beef farms. Bet you didn't know Florida is the 4th greatest beef producer in the United States. Okay, so it's all rural. So we wanted to study this. And so this is a map in Palm Beach County, which you may think of as a super affluent community, and it is, but only if you live on the coast. If you don't live on the coast, not so affluent. And so the area around Lake Okeechobee colloquially is called the Glades, right? So you have the Glades and the coast. And so we had a grant to look at the risk of vascular cognitive impairment in rural populations. Now, this is the area deprivation index map for Florida. So that's the whole state of Florida. I pulled out Palm Beach County. And so that's the Glades, red's bad. That's the coast, blue's good. But you notice there's some red along the coast, and those are all the African-American communities along the coast of Florida. They're not actually on the coast. You can't get beachfront property, right? Because that costs, $10 million a home, right? But as you move inside, you're in inner city. And so we were able to then look at the difference between rurality and urban living across different socioeconomic and cognitive groups. And so this is just for the African Americans that we studied in this study. We looked at an urban population, a suburban population, and a rural population. And what you may notice is the suburban population looks a little bit different than the other two groups. There's some statistical differences, there's some numerical differences, but they look different. But really the only difference was that they had money, right? So they had more resources. And so the predictors of impairment was being older, having less education, having lower socioeconomic status, having poorer diet, being less mindful, having less mental and physical activities, having more vascular risk factors, having higher vulnerability and lower resilience, okay? All the things that happen when people don't have resources and access to care. But we did want to ask this question about rurality, and we found that actually living in a rural area itself didn't increase your risk. What increased your risk was working in agriculture, right? So actually working on a farm or in an agricultural industry actually increased the risk quite a bit. So it was about a threefold risk, increased risk for farm workers compared to non-farm workers, whether you lived in an urban area or a rural area. Because you could get from an urban area to a rural area with a 45 to 60-minute drive. Okay. So switch topics a little bit. What about other populations we haven't studied? So I have been fortunate to work with a number of groups, and we're able to study American Indians and Alaska Natives. And so what's interesting is the group of older Indian and Alaska Natives have increased dramatically, right? And so it's roughly doubled in a fairly short period of time. And that community is becoming more and more aware of Alzheimer's and related disorders. But there's really a dearth of validation efforts to try to understand what kind of tools might work in these communities. And so I'm the creator of the ADA. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that test, but it's a brief screening test that's used around the world to screen for dementia. And so we said, this is a good self-report. Let's try to apply it to this population. But the first thing we had to do is understand, does it work in this population? Right? So we looked at the psychometric properties of the 88 in American Indian elders, and then we studied the prevalence of disease. So those are the questions for the 88s, 8 yes/no questions. And again, we've done validation studies all over the world and translating it into multiple languages. And so really, we knew that it would work in most cases, but we had to test this hypothesis. So what we found was we studied about 1,800 American Indian older adults across 3 community events. We collected lots of data. We looked at psychometric properties. So it had excellent fit, model fit, right? We had good reliability. We did item response therapy, showed very, very good properties. And we used this to identify about 27% of older American Indian elders had probable cognitive impairments, pretty high prevalence rate in these community events. And we found a bunch of risk factors: low education, being unemployed, head injury, alcohol use, lack of exercise, not following sort of traditional tribal ways, lower socialization and engagement, mood disturbances, lower mental and physical health. Now, you saw this cartoon a little while ago, right? This is the more updated one. This was all 14 risk factors. So these cartoons are largely been drawn from epidemiologic studies, which were largely done in American white and Northern European populations, right? So we don't really know whether these factors apply across all individuals, but in our study, we actually identified a whole bunch of them that actually align with this cartoon, right? So that we're actually able to test hypotheses of what risk factors put different groups at different risks. The other thing is that we can then engage other people to come into this field, right? So Dr. Moon is one of my mentees. She's a social worker. She also happens to be Korean, and she's studying American Indians. And so this was an opportunity to actually engage someone that this is not a topic that she had ever really thought about, and how can we start to address this and talk about this. And so she took my study that I did in Missouri, now 20 years ago, and said, well, can we study this in American Indians to understand their understanding of their intention to screen? And what we found that self-efficacy was by far the biggest driver, of whether someone's going to be willing to be screened. And she just got a score on her R15, and she got a 12. Right now, who knows if anybody's ever going to be funded ever again, but a 12 is a good score. And so we're hopeful that she will get her R15. Switching topics once again. So, the United States is not just the 50 states. There's lots of territories that the United States is owned. And American Samoa is a little bit different because all of the other territories are incorporated territories. But American Samoa is an unincorporated territory. So American Samoa is actually responsible for their own borders. They're responsible. They have their own government. They can vote, but they don't have any electoral representation. So it's a vote, but the vote doesn't count for anything. It counts in the popular vote, but not for anything else, right? So, and it's the only U.S. territory that's in the Southern Hemisphere. Okay. So that's a map, and I don't have a pointer, but you can see New Zealand. And if you trace all the way up at the top, that's Hawaii. And American Samoa is dead center in the middle. So it's really not by anything. It's a 6-hour flight to either of those places. Okay. It's extremely limited healthcare. Okay. There are 3 government healthcare providers. There's 1 hospital. There are 5 FQHCs, and there's Department of Human and Social Services that does WIC and things like that, okay? There are almost no private practitioners on the islands. There's more than 1 island. On the islands, there's 1 dentist, 2 primary care doctors, and 1 chiropractor. That's it. That's the entire health system, right, in a part of the United States, right, where 50,000 people live, of which 24% of them are older adults. Okay. There are no neurologists. There are 3 psychiatrists. There's no MRI. There's no PET scan. There is a CT scan in a trailer. So if you get a disease, you have to fly to Hawaii to get an MRI. You can only fly to Hawaii on Monday and Thursday. Okay, that's it. That's the only way to get off the island. Monday and Thursday, you can fly to Hawaii, or you could take a little puddle hopper to independent Samoa, which is an independent country that's on the other side of the international date line. Okay, that's it. So there were no known studies about what the risk of disease is in this population, a vastly understudied population. Again, and these are the islands in American Samoa, and most of our studies were done in Tutuila, which is where most of the people live. So we wrote a R01 that got funded. It's Pupui Malu Manatu, which is protecting memories. And so we did a study. So the first thing we did was, what do they know about disease? So we took our instrument, our dementia literacy test, we translated it into Samoan, and then we administered it in American Samoa, and we're able to demonstrate gains in health literacy in the population. We also understood what they knew and didn't know about the disease. We then did the uniform data set. So we did the ADRC workup in the American Samoa. So we had gold standard with plasma, blood-based biomarkers, and genetics. And so we were able to look at people who had impairment versus no impairment. And that's just some of their demographics. But was really interesting when we looked at some of the blood-based biomarkers. The first thing is that there was absolutely no difference between impaired people and unimpaired people by any of the Alzheimer biomarkers. Okay, so Alzheimer's disease does not seem to be the defining cause of cognitive impairment in American Samoans. Now, if you've ever seen football, a lot of football players, a lot of American Samoans play football. They're a large people, right? They're a large people genetically, but they're also a large people because they eat lots of processed foods, right? Because it's a very high water table, so there's not a lot of farming that's done there. And so almost all of their meat is canned meat, and almost all their vegetables are canned vegetables. And so it's very, very high in sugar and salt. So diabetes, obesity, vascular risk factors are very, very high in this population. And so what you can see is that for A beta 42, p-tau, really no difference between the two groups. I said there was no MRI, so we raised funds and we were able to buy the very first MRI and placed it in American Samoa. Now, it's not the full MRI because we didn't have $5 million, but we were able to place a swoop, right, which is a low field magnet, doesn't require the whole leaded building. We're able to actually buy the swoop and install it in American Samoa. That's our staff getting trained on doing MRIs. That's me reviewing the MRIs with the staff. That's our very first research participant, the very first American Samoan getting an MRI. So what have we learned so far? A lot of our work is try to understand this. And we talk about social determinants, but social determinants are really early life challenges, right? What's the quality of your education? What's your access to healthcare? What's your food security, right? What's your housing and the factors of discrimination? If you have all of these things against you, it puts you at really midlife consequences: obesity, physical inactivity, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, diabetes. And then the medical determinants of health really take over, right? So your medical comorbidities then lead you to those deleterious late life outcomes: Alzheimer's disease, vascular cognitive impairment, stroke, heart attack, and frailty. And so our research has really tried to understand why. Now, I'm not a health policy person. I don't claim to be a health policy person. But if you don't have answers to why, how could you build a policy to help people? So brain health and concerns are increasingly important to minoritized communities, but centuries of discriminatory activities have really led to a mistrust in medical institutions, a distrust of research, and vast inequities. And while there are challenges, there are really great opportunities to make a difference. So by studying vulnerability and resilience, by studying brain health, we're able to then really start to place people and understand where they are along their journey and make some differences. These social determinants of health play an important role. Lower resources in early life lead to more vascular risk factors in midlife, which leads to a higher risk of Alzheimer's disease and related disorders in late life. Knowledge is power. Right? We can only make a difference by increasing the knowledge of those people we're trying to serve. And so our approach has always been to take a healthy body, healthy spirit, healthy brain approach. That's very acceptable in many communities, and that allows to tie their spiritual and mental well-being to their brain health. And so these allow us to engage diverse communities, increase research readiness, and provide really important information so we can better inform practitioners, policymakers, and researchers, and better serve the communities. And our goal is to build a better brain, build a better you. Thank you. Sorry, I went a little long.
Well, thank you, Dr. Galvin. That was amazing. I think I'm ready for trivia night after all the tips you gave us. Any questions for Dr. Galvin? It was a very inspirational talk. I have a question. Obviously, there's a lot of factors and a lot of different conditions that lead to cognitive impairment. And it might be too early to know this, but have you noticed in your research that you have done that there are certain factors that are more likely to lead to a certain type of dementia, Lewy body, vascular, Alzheimer's, or we're not there yet?
So a lot of the risk factors for any of the dementias are very similar. I would say the one dementia that's very different is frontal temporal degeneration, which seems to have a whole set of other risk factors, more genetic-based risk factors in many ways. But vascular Lewy body and Alzheimer's disease are so comorbid that they actually share risk factors. And if I could tell you the one risk factor that by far is the biggest risk factor, it's insulin resistance and diabetes. I mean, if we could get rid of insulin-resistant diabetes, we would have so much better health outcomes for older adults.
I don't have access to.
Okay, so this one comes from Christina Roman. She says, thank you for your talk, Dr. Galvin. Regarding health literacy, many times health literacy is defined or seen as being related to the individual. However, the reality is that an individual or community's health knowledge is significantly impacted by systemic factors. The onus is not entirely on the individual. Thus, with regard to the health literacy results presented, how does the incorporation of systems/institutions and system-driven isms influence the approach and results? And then she has a couple other questions. I don't know if you want to do that one first.
Can you read the last part of that question? I don't think I quite got it.
She's wondering about incorporating the system's influence on the health literacy versus the individual health literacy, and how you understand the differences there. What is the individual responsibility versus the system?
Well, I don't think it's much as an individual responsibility, but it's important for each individual to figure out for each individual what they know or don't know and understand about a concept, right? And so this has allowed us to provide sort of personalized and tailored information and educational material based on where someone's starting from, right? And we use the stories to try to help them understand the concept in a better way. And then we could see if they gain some knowledge, but then we could do very tailored information. So after someone completes the task, we can figure out what they know and what they still didn't learn. We can find out where the deficits are, and then we can address those deficits on an individual basis. I don't think we're really trying to do it in a system-wide level, because while you can try to raise the level of knowledge within a community, that's important, but people don't go to seek healthcare as a community. They seek healthcare as an individual.
Okay, there was a couple other questions. How do the health literacy outcomes translate to the real world, and would you expect health literacy gains to be maintained if the systems remain the same?
Again, I think systems are a big thing to change. It's not an easy thing to change. I think we have to start. You have to start somewhere, right? People have heard me say this before, the beginning of every epic journey is the first step, right? And so we're taking those first steps to try to improve on an individual basis. If you empower people, then people are able to hopefully seek out resources that'll help them get better health outcomes. Changing the system, that's a lot harder to do.
And then the last part was just, how can we best encourage a new definition of health literacy to incorporate all of these components? It's relatedly to what you said.
We had to start somewhere, and there really was no way to really address dementia health literacy. And so we tried to tackle that problem in a way that it doesn't matter what your background is, we could do it. So we did it in American Samoa, we did it in Spanish, we did it in African Americans, we did it in rural populations. It didn't matter the setting, right? Because the stories were all culturally adaptable, right? And so people learned, and that's the beginning of changing things, is giving them the knowledge.
We also have one more question from someone else.
Not about health literacy.
This is not about health literacy. This is from Kendra Anderson. She says, thank you for the amazing talk. Since early life experiences set the foundation for brain health, are there any initiatives that partner with our pediatric colleagues? It seems like the focus has been mid to late life, when the health comorbidities are already accelerating cognitive decline.
Yeah, I mean, I think, addressing things in early life is always a little bit more challenging, because you have to change systems in a lot of ways. So I was at NYU for many years, and Manhattan's an interesting place, right? Because if you got past 115th Street, you would quickly notice that something no longer existed up there, and that was a supermarket. And so basically from 115th Street up, there were no supermarkets, right? There were bodegas, but there were no supermarkets, right? And so people lived in food deserts. And if you have a limited income and you have to shop at a bodega and a Twinkie costs you $1 and you can get 2 Twinkies, or an apple costs you $1, you get 1 apple, right? You get 2 meals from eating Twinkies, but only 1 meal from eating an apple, right? And so if you don't have resources and you live in a food desert, these are things that are really difficult to challenge and change. But you first have to understand what the problem is before you can address the problem, right? So you can be part of the problem, you can be part of the solution. I'd rather be part of the solution by first defining what the problem is.
Yes, thank you for your talk. I was wondering, in the American Samoa study that you did, I thought it was interesting that there were no differences in the Alzheimer's disease biomarkers. So were there any determinants or risk factors that you did identify that could, that were at higher, people at higher risk for dementia?
Body habitus, diabetes, and vascular risk factors seem to be driving it. So we are now looking sort of as age strata, right? Because we have enough people. We have close to 1,000 people that we've studied now, right? And so we could start to look by decade and see if that, because it's possible that in the oldest old, we'll see changes in the biomarkers. When you look at the group as a whole, it's kind of washed out. But when we start looking at sort of decade strata, we might see that, you know, the 50 to 60-year-olds don't have any Alzheimer changes. The 60 to 70-year-olds have, you know, negligible Alzheimer changes, and the 70 and 80-year-olds, they have some Alzheimer changes. So we're now going to start looking at that. What I showed you was the group as a whole, and we didn't see any differences. But I think it's going to be largely a vascular-driven type of problem. Phenotypically, it looks like Alzheimer's disease, but I don't think that in many individuals, it's a predominantly Alzheimer's problem. ApoE also does not seem to be a risk factor. There's no difference in ApoE in between the impaired people and the unimpaired people. Thank you.
Thank you.